In the late 1990s, elite colleges and universities began to open their gates to a more diverse student body, but admission is not the same as acceptance. Anthony Abraham Jack shows that the struggles of low-income students continue long after they've arrived on campus. Through interviews conducted at a renowned university, he shows how powerfully students' backgrounds affect their chances of success. In this excerpt, Jack, who grew up in a distressed neighborhood in Miami and then attended a prep school, describes his own experience starting with his first day at Amherst College. The Privileged Poor: How Elite Colleges Are Failing Disadvantaged Students, by Anthony Abraham Jack. Where are the other poor black kids? This is the first question I remember asking myself, a chubby freshman with my hair in cornrows, while walking across the Amherst College campus. I was in the center of the main quad, standing outside Johnson Chapel. The lawn was freshly mowed. It looked pristine, a shimmering deep green. The evening, slightly chilly for a Miami transplant such as myself, was filled with excitement as the incoming freshmen meandered around, nervously greeting one another. Conversations bubbled all around me. Wasting little time, my new peers enlisted me in a rite of passage that, 15 years later, I now call convocation conversations. Those quick, casual introductory chats that happen en route to meals and classes, where students conveniently work in verbal versions of their resumes and narrate their summer itineraries for any and all to hear. These strangers, my new classmates, swapped stories of summer fun, multi-week trips abroad, fancy parties at summer homes, courtside seats at professional basketball games, invitations to private premieres of movies that, as far as I knew, had not yet hit theaters. Many of these kids were white, but the black students were chiming in too, going tit for tat recounting the elaborate stories behind their passport stamps. One black classmate casually mentioned that she had flown on a private jet. I thought back to my first time on a plane, which had been just a few months ago, me struggling to chew 5 pieces of Wrigley's Doublemint gum because everyone made me afraid that my ears would pop, as I boarded a Delta Airlines flight from Fort Lauderdale to Hartford, Connecticut, for my Amherst football recruiting trip. I tried to think of a story that I could add. The only family vacations I had known were drives up I-95 from Miami to a cousin's house in Georgia. These rich kids had their own version of summer. In my family, summer was just a season, 100 days of heat, humidity, and hurricanes, and mosquitoes. I was surrounded by affluence. Some of my Amherst classmates were flat out rich. The Amherst brochure boasted that roughly 40% of students received financial aid, but I knew what that really meant. More than half of my classmates came from families that made too much money to qualify for any financial aid. I was not surprised by the wealth. After all, I already knew what it meant to go to school with rich people. I had just finished my senior year at Gulliver Preparatory, a wealthy private high school in Miami. Although I was only there for a year, it gave me a taste of what was to come, both socially and academically. My best friend at Gulliver, whose father convinced me to start eating burgers medium instead of well done, which was the rule in my house, received a car his senior year, and an all-expenses paid backpacking trip through Europe as a graduation gift. The first time I heard the word hostel was while sitting in the larger of the 2-family rooms in their sprawling Spanish-style home. But there was a difference between what I had expected at Gulliver and what I found at Amherst. While I was not shocked by the wealth, I was surprised by its color. The rich kids at Gulliver, those who drove Range Rovers and boasted of extravagant vacations, were not black. But at Amherst, many of my new wealthy classmates were. What I discovered that afternoon was the same thing I would read about years later, as a sociology graduate student in William Bowen and Derek Bach's groundbreaking study of American higher education, The Shape of the River. Bowen and Bach found that the majority of black students at the 28 elite colleges and universities they studied, from Ivy League institutions like Columbia University to flagship public universities like the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, came from upper-income families. My Amherst classmates were no exception. Some were the sons of Bain Capital and McKinsey and Company. Others were the daughters of the Mayo Clinic and Massachusetts General Hospital. I was not. I was a Head Start kid from Coconut Grove, a distressed community that, in 2013, the Miami Herald called a neighborhood that time forgot. My mother patrolled the hallways of Ponce de Leon Middle School for over 30 years, wearing a green polo shirt with security in white block letters emblazoned across its back. By day, my older brother, his pale blue uniform peppered with bleach spots, cleaned the classrooms of the old elementary school. By night, he cleaned the emergency rooms at South Miami Hospital. Before I transferred to Gulliver, the closest I got to rich was through the stories my grandmother told me. For her entire adult life, she cleaned the homes of wealthy white families, mainly doctors and lawyers. When my cousin was arrested for possession of a controlled substance, one of my grandmother's employers, a lawyer, represented him as a favor for her 20-plus years of service. She did not gossip about what went on inside her employers' homes. Now and then, however, she would let slip a detail about an expensive purchase or a lavish family trip. The father of one of the families, a commercial pilot, invited my grandmother to travel on one of his flights so that she could hear his voice come across the intercom greeting passengers as they took their seats. She never did go. But second-hand accounts and unanswered invitations were the extent of my exposure. Wealth was always just a story to me. Hearing my classmates at Amherst recount their adventures, just as distant as those my grandmother shared when we sat at her knee, I resigned myself to be, yet again, one of the few poor black people in a rich, mostly white place, just as I had been at Gulliver. My hasty conclusion that afternoon was reasonable. Higher education in America is highly unequal and disturbingly stratified. Youth from poor families of all races, but especially those from Black and Latino families, are less likely to go to college than their wealthy peers. When they do go to college, they rarely attend schools like Amherst. Although half of all undergraduates in the United States are the first in their family to go to college, with most of those coming from poor backgrounds, first-generation college students are disproportionately relegated to community college, for-profit colleges, and less selective four-year colleges. Those institutions share some troubling traits. Resources are few, aid for students is scarce, and retention is low. The same disproportion, of course, works in reverse. The more selective the college, the fewer the number of students from disadvantaged backgrounds in terms of both class and race. In their examination of college demographics between 1982 and 2006, Anthony Carnvale and Jeff Stroll of the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce clearly documented this phenomenon. At the most competitive tier of colleges, think Columbia, Princeton, Stanford, just 14% of undergraduates came from the bottom half of the country's income distribution. At the second most competitive tier, the likes of Dickinson, Furman, and Skidmore, just 16% did. This paucity of lower-income students at the most selective colleges and universities, which comprised 193 institutions at the time of their study, stands in stark contrast to the fact that in these same two tiers, 63 and 70% of students, respectively, came from the top quartile of the income distribution. Put another way, children from well-to-do families, as measured in terms of earnings, took up two-thirds of the seats at the best schools. New data provide a more detailed and even more discouraging snapshot of where Americans from families of different income levels go to college. In 2017, the economist Raj Chetty and his colleagues found that students from families in the top 1%, those with incomes of more than $630,000 a year, are 77 times more likely to attend an Ivy League college than are students from families that make $30,000 a year or less. The study showed that a startling number of elite colleges, 38 by their count, including places like Colby College and Bucknell University, have more students from families in the top 1% than from families in the bottom 60%, the growing group of families that make less than $65,000. At Colorado College, the ratio is greater than 2 to 1. At Washington University in St. Louis, it is just over 3.5 to 1. Another comparison, this time looking at the college destinations of the super-rich. puts this inequality into even sharper perspective. Chetty's report showed that the percentage of students from families in the top 0.1% who attended elite universities was the same as the percentage of students from poor families who attended any college at all, either 2-year or 4-year. We might have better data now, but the situation itself is not new. Indeed, for more than 2 decades, colleges have faced significant pressure to do more to combat inequality, and in particular, to use their considerable wealth to address the affordability problem of higher education. In 2008, just before the financial crisis, the Senate Finance Committee admonished colleges for not spending more of their growing endowments on financial aid and access. The public has chimed in as well, lamenting the rising tuition costs that have priced out a growing segment of the American population. Colleges were, and still are, missing out on students from humble means who have a powerful drive to succeed. To address this inequality in access, which was keeping poor youth from reaping the benefits of an elite education, as well as to respond to public outcries against skyrocketing costs, a few colleges introduced no-loan financial aid policies in the late 1990s. Rather than the usual combination of scholarships and loans, which was still prohibitively expensive for many poor families, schools began to create financial aid packages that replaced loans with grants and other forms of aid intended to help recruit and then support academically gifted applicants from disadvantaged backgrounds. Princeton University began this movement in 1998. Then President Harold T. Shapiro noted of the policy, "Our aim is to do as much as we can to be sure that no student decides not to apply to Princeton solely for financial reasons." A number of colleges followed Princeton's lead. Amherst did so in 1999, which helped pave the way for my admission a few years later. By 2008, all the Ivies were on board. Stanford University, MIT, and Duke University adopted similar policies. Although enacted mostly by private colleges, no loan financial aid was taken up by some flagship public universities as well. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill was the first public university to do so in 2003. The University of Virginia and the University of Michigan followed suit soon thereafter. Donald Saleh, former Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid at Cornell University, expressed the general sentiment about this new approach to aid. There is an importance in having socioeconomic diversity so that campuses reflect the country in general, rather than a campus that is upper income. These revolutionary policies increased access to many universities, especially elite ones. The effects were felt right away. Student bodies began to look different. Vassar College, which in 2015 won the inaugural Cook Prize for Equity in Educational Excellence, nearly doubled the percentage of Pell Grant eligible students. Students from families in the bottom quarter of the income distribution, from 12% in 2008 to 23% in 2015. The University of North Carolina and Amherst reported that at least 20% of the students who enrolled between 2012 and 2014 were from lower income families. Elite colleges may be few in number, but their influence on the lives of individual students and on American society as a whole is outsized. For students from disadvantaged backgrounds, attending an elite college or university serves as a mobility springboard. Graduating from any college provides benefits, especially to students belonging to groups that are the recipients of policy initiatives aimed to diversify universities along class and racial lines. But this difference is even more pronounced for elite colleges, where graduation rates are higher. The nation's most selective colleges boast graduation rates of 90% or more, while the average for community colleges is 57%. While some of this gap is due to differences in the preparation of the students who attend each type of institution, there is no doubt that more resources and support are available at elite colleges and universities. The economic payoff of attendance is also larger. A 1999 study found that graduates of elite private schools had incomes 39% higher than those of their peers who attended low-ranked public universities. Whether looking at Supreme Court justices or leaders of different industries, Alumni from elite colleges and universities are the norm rather than the exception. The sociologist Lauren Rivera has shown that students from elite institutions have an advantage when trying to enter lucrative fields like management consulting, law, and investment banking. As a result, alumni of elite colleges dominate the ranks in those companies. The shift in the makeup of the undergraduate population at elite schools is remarkable. More and more colleges are enacting policies to promote the social mobility of those from humble means. They are being celebrated and rewarded for their efforts to diversify their campuses and, by extension, to expand the ranks of the future leaders of America. The doors to elite colleges are increasingly open to lower income students, but just how wide open are they? Let us not forget that Princeton, despite introducing this change in financial aid policy, remains one of the 38 universities that have more students from the top 1% than the bottom 60%. Lower income students may be entering elite colleges in greater numbers now than they were 50 years ago, but these campuses are still bastions of wealth, built on the customs, traditions, and policies that reflect the tastes and habits of the rich. I believe we should congratulate these colleges and universities on their willingness to innovate. Yet we cannot stop there. We must inquire further. Who are the students admitted to college under these new financial aid regimes? And what happens to them when they arrive on campus? Now that they have gained access to an elite institution, how do they make a home in its hallowed halls? That afternoon on the Amherst Quad, after milling around and making small talk, I marched along with my classmates into Valentine Dining Hall. Imagine my surprise when I learned that the young black woman sitting next to me, who had just graduated from a snooty day school and had studied abroad in Spain the previous year, also came from a single-parent home and was the first in her family to attend college. After discovering our common past, we felt the flush of comfort that comes with shared impoverishment, but also shared freedoms. We immediately started telling stories of life before Amherst. We both grew up in segregated neighborhoods where just about everybody was black. The white people we did see fell into three easily identifiable categories: police officers, crackheads, and people who had lost their way. Her family, too, struggled to make ends meet from time to time. Both of us had done homework by candlelight, not for atmosphere, but because the power was out. She and I laughed and commiserated over the desperate search for end-of-the-month money. Soon a few other students at our table joined in. We were not the only ones, it turned out, who had experienced poverty in our youth, but had been exposed to a different world when we went to a prep school. The vacation homes I heard about from some of my new friends during those convocation conversations, I discovered, were not always their own. They often belonged to the families of their wealthy high school classmates, the ones that we all made nice with, for a few glimpses at the good life. I was not alone. I was not the only poor black kid on campus, and I was not the only one who had already been granted access to experiences and places beyond what my family could afford, or even knew about. My classmate and I were not as different as I thought. We were both poor and privileged. College view books, magazine-style recruiting tools that colleges put together to advertise themselves, contain glossy snapshots of campus life. These days, such snapshots almost always highlight diversity. The black and brown faces are placed front and center, as are the statistics documenting the cosmopolitan nature of the student body. But appearances, as we know, can be deceiving, and statistics can lie or at least hide deeper truths. While it is doubtless true that colleges are more diverse now than they were a generation ago, this does not mean that these institutions reflect the full variety of American society. Essentially, colleges hedge their admission bets. They diversify their student bodies by drawing from old sources. We know that poor youth make up only a small fraction of the students who attend private high schools in the United States. We also know that poor black students are only a fraction of that small population. But it is this tiny slice of a slice, I discovered, who are primarily admitted to selective colleges. Over 50% of the lower income black undergraduates who attend elite colleges get there from boarding, day, and preparatory high schools, well endowed, highly selective schools that pride themselves on fostering independent thought and extending learning beyond the classroom through close contact with faculty. Chances are at least half of the poor black kids I met that first day at Amherst had graduated from elite private high schools like Phillips Academy Andover in Massachusetts and St. Paul's School in New Hampshire. When you envision a wealthy private high school with its top flight facilities and abundant resources, that image likely has a color attached to it, white. Thus, when most people see poor black students at an elite college, they simply don't think that those students might have come from an exclusive high school. These prep schools are full of students from affluent families, mostly white but not exclusively so, and offer academic and social opportunities usually reserved for the rich, from study abroad opportunities to language immersion programs to contact with faculty who have advanced degrees. Lower income graduates from these high schools enter college already accustomed to navigating elite academic arenas, already familiar with the ways and customs of the rich. True, they are poor, but they have the privilege of an early introduction to the world they will enter in college. I call this group of students the privileged poor. Then there is the other half of lower income black students at elite colleges. This group of students enters college from exactly where most people would expect: local neighborhood schools that are often distressed, overcrowded, and under-resourced. The teachers are likely to be younger and have less experience in the profession and less support than their counterparts in more affluent communities. Maintaining order often takes precedence over teaching, as neighborhood problems penetrate school boundaries. These schools are also likely to be segregated both racially and socioeconomically. Undergraduates who enter college from these schools traverse troubled hallways and endure disordered classrooms before college. When they first set foot on an elite college campus, it looks, feels, and functions like nothing they have experienced before. I call these students, who are both poor and unfamiliar with this new world, the doubly disadvantaged. The situation of two distinct tracks to college is not limited to black students. Many lower income white and Asian American students also travel an alternative route through private high schools, albeit at lower rates. Latinos, too. One-third of lower income Latino students at elite colleges and universities hail from private high schools like the Brearley School in New York and the Thatcher School in California. The other two-thirds stayed close to home for high school. Before I arrived at Amherst all those years ago, like most 18-year-olds, I was blissfully ignorant of the complexity all around me. I knew that I had studied hard. I know I got to go to a great school and do something that no one in my family had ever done, but I had no idea that my detour through Gulliver was a well-established on-ramp that a great many students across the country traveled en route to college. Until I learned the stories of some of my classmates at Amherst, I thought I was the only one. It was only years later that I started to fully grasp these truths. It was also years later, as a graduate student in sociology, that I realized that I was far from the only one who was ignorant here. The very social scientists I was now eagerly reading, analyzing, and learning from had also ignored this distinction within disadvantaged youth, its origins, and how it manifests itself in college.